right. Thanks so much to Travis for that great introduction. As he said, my name is Bill Doerrfeld, and I have been for the last 10 years or so, almost 10 years, been working with Nordic APIs. We run this blog, as he mentioned. We've been doing these thought pieces covering the API economy for years and years, and I have the special opportunity to work with a lot of cool community members to get their stories told. And we also work with some writers on a weekly basis. So it's one of the premier publications covering APIs, everything from design, security, how to build a platform, how to secure it, how to monetize it, and et cetera. So that's all very cool, but I don't want to talk about any of that right now. I want to talk about walking. I am an avid walker. I know it's like the laziest form of exercise out there, but I love it. I go on about an hour-long walk every day, and there's proven health benefits to regularly walking, I've been told. It improves your metabolism, your joint health. I even saw one study that says if you walk regularly, you'll have more brain mass in your later ages. So I love walking. I live in Maine, which is in the northeast side of the United States, and we just have a lot of beautiful walking trails, a lot of trees everywhere. And recently I came across this other concept called strollology. It's essentially the science of walking around. It was coined by Swiss sociologist Lucius Burckhardt, and his idea is essentially that through walking, our perception of the world enhances, and we learn to understand how we perceive the world. I think related, people back in ancient Greece used to walk around. Plato and Socrates, it was part of their Platonic or Socratic dialogues to walk and talk and think through very complex issues. So where does that leave us with APIs? Well, I would like to do that today, to go on a walk with everyone and look at the major trends as we see them along this trail through the API economy. So we're going to start by looking at why APIs are so pervasive. I want to look at briefly some trends around AI and developer experience, things like API drift and where specifications are at these days, and hopefully give you a foundation for the conference so you can kind of look at all these different topics and pop into sessions that you might find interesting. I don't think we'll cover a complete, cohesive, comprehensive view of everything happening in the API economy, but hopefully we'll give you a little bit of a taste. So let's embark on this trail, this walk through the API economy. First off, as I said in my keynote last year, APIs are more relevant than ever. They're very pervasive. Most developers are already using APIs. I believe I showed this study last year as well. Nearly 90% of developers are using APIs for things like third-party API integration, private internal services, and partner-facing ecosystems. So they're the foundation of a lot of what we do in software development, and they continue to proliferate into countless areas. As I said last year, I made the case that APIs are relevant more than ever. Even grandmothers and little kids might be interfacing with them on the end user side of things, even if they might not know about it. Well, I kind of failed to mention that there's plenty of other areas in the back end and like internal architectures for Microsoft, for microservices, in terms of like wrapping databases. The whole security and identity side of enterprise architecture involves a lot of APIs. If we look at, back-end cloud and DevOps, we have a lot of APIs back there as well. New kind of more external-facing partner ecosystems, affiliate networks. And if we're looking at trends like open banking and finance, even government, healthcare, there's a lot of other standards out there looking to standardize how APIs are exchanging data for end users and businesses alike. So it's part of so much emerging tech out there, from generative AI to blockchain and whatnot. But yet, despite their significance, Few are aware of the importance of APIs in IT or the global economy, as this has largely been a silent revolution, says Marco Palladino, CTO at Kong. So it's remarkable. We talk about this all the time. I run a blog about this. We come into conferences, but yet still, the IT world isn't that aware of APIs, according to one of the leading CTOs in the API industry. So I think that comment is pretty relevant, and it's going to come back to haunt us later on in the trail, as we'll see. But going on, another trend we're seeing is the rise of AI, of course. I'll be the first to rip off the AI Band-Aid at a tech conference. You can't really go to any one of these without seeing something about AI, so I'll be the first to bring it up. Sorry. But AI really hit consumer mass with ChatGPT. This study was pretty remarkable. It only took ChatGPT to reach 5 days to reach 1 million users, whereas it took other companies like Netflix, years to reach that kind of critical mass. And now it's receiving over 600 million monthly visits. So it's just a huge surge in interest and use. And I think this is pretty relevant to the API space as well. I think that more AI, the rise in AI, is going to be synergistic with APIs. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship because AI products are integrating their features through APIs most of the time. APIs can also be used for training and fetching data for these LLMs. And on the other hand of the equation, AI is also could also help how we manage APIs, how we test them and secure them, as I'll mention briefly in a second. And according to GitHub, 92% of programmers are already using AI tools. I've seen some other figures out there on the exact productivity enhancements from AI, ranging from like 30 to 70% increase. It really depends on the study, and who's sponsoring it, of course. But we've seen a lot of interest and growth in AI for the development sphere at large. And we pose this question, whether people in the API economy plan to adopt AI in their API development and or API consumption. And a good percent of them say they do. About 70% of organizations have that on the horizon. So people in our economy, our slice of the tech industry, are thinking about this. I think AI could potentially benefit how we manage APIs by generating documentation or code samples, being used to enhance the developer experience through that. We've seen some interesting use cases of like integrating AI within developer portals to help make sense of documentation and such. There's also the whole testing and security and ongoing monitoring of APIs. Like I was checking out this interesting ChatGPT plugin called Hacking GPT, where you can send it a specification or a JWT, and it'll respond with potential vulnerabilities. So it's helping improve our awareness of these potential faults with our services. So there's plenty of potential areas out there. Some people in the space say it's going to produce APIs for you, and it's going to produce the code that consumes the APIs. By it, of course, we're talking about generative AI. This is what Paul Dumas, API strategist and former Gartner analyst, said at our Austin summit earlier this year. So people are making some pretty bullish statements about the rise in AI and its symbiotic relationship with API management. Frank Kilcoman's principal API technical evangelist at SmartBear even told me that Gen AI copilots and assistants are elevating the human experience in API management. So there's a lot of potential for this rise in AI to work alongside APIs. Yet, we need to talk about the drawbacks here, because we've seen a lot of hallucinations out there, some questionable code quality as a result of this over-reliance upon AI. It can produce some pretty staggering privacy and IP implications, depending on where or what the AI was trained on and the provenance of that data. And as we've seen, it can have some bias in terms of, creed, ethnicity, gender even. There's a lot of potential drawbacks of AI depending on what, the training data set was used for that AI service. So definitely some interesting drawbacks to consider where AI is concerned. Something that's very relevant to APIs was this example. Essentially, the OpenCage API is a geolocation service. And they found that they were getting requests from developers asking for a service that does not exist whatsoever. They were looking at ChatGPT, asking ChatGPT for a reverse phone number lookup service, and it turned out that it was just hallucinating that the service existed. And it led to some really unhappy developer conversations and frustrations with the API service. Just a funny service, or a funny story of this actually happening in practice and how it could potentially affect the API economy. So essentially, we're still at that walk, don't run part of AI and its integration with what we do with APIs, I personally think. So if we compare it to our trail analogy, maybe you might slip a little along the way. Let's check out description languages, because there's some interesting trends happening with that lately in the API economy. Oops. TypeSpec has emerged on the scene. This is a new description language for APIs. It's kind of aiding this design-first approach. This was developed at Microsoft and open sourced for everyone to use. It's based on TypeScript, so anyone familiar with that language might have an easygoing time using TypeSpec. Arazo specification is a new spec pioneered by people at the Open API initiative. And I love the word for this. It's Italian for tapestry, which is so great because the specification is essentially being built to define workflows or a series of intermeshed API calls, which could have some cool use cases where AI is concerned, or different trigger-based actions. Basically, we rely upon a lot of interconnected API workflows out there, but it hasn't really had a standard way to define or document them until now. So that's what Arazo is doing. And I think there's at least 1 or 2 presentations talking about that at the conference this year. Open API, the standard definition format for APIs, continues to evolve. They're making new improvements on the major V3 of the specification, and they're on the way toward what they're codenaming Moonwalk V4. And I'm not exactly sure when that will be released, but we're keeping tabs on that. Some people in the industry have revived the apis.json project and its sister directory, apis.io, which is kind of like a sitemap.xml file for describing websites, but for describing the business-related metadata for API services. So some interesting API descriptions to keep tabs on, understand what's happening in our space. We've also seen this debate arise, is it really good to do spec-first development, design-first, or can we just do code first? Well, I would argue that there's a lot of benefits of relying on specifications. It can enhance the discoverability and usability of your service. It could potentially improve API developer integration and production time. Like I said, some of the new specifications are catering to new API or AI-based workflows. And really, when you have a specification as a source of truth, you can have more consistent documentation and generate the documentation or code samples and software developer kits from that core spec. So there's a lot of benefits of going specification first, yet still documentation as a whole, it needs more attention in our industry. I was pretty impressed by this study I found from EMA. Basically, only 10% of organizations fully document their APIs, they found. I think they also found about 70% of organizations have 30% of their APIs undocumented. So there's a lot of potential holes out there, and I think this could lead to some pretty unhappy consequences, like improper inventory management of APIs. Or it could lead to zombie and shadow APIs. There's a recent SALT security study that just came out finding this was a top concern according to where we're at with API security. So basically, a shadow API is something that is like shadow IT, but for APIs. It's happening in the background. It might not be managed anymore, and it could even be this zombie ghoul floating around. So another potential outcome of poor documentation practices and a lack of inventory management when API development is concerned. I'm really glad I just put this presentation together a few days ago because this was a totally new trend that just came out, API drift. Interestingly enough, this study came out from API Context, which found that 75% of APIs have non-conformant endpoints. So drift is essentially meaning that the production actions, the production behavior does not match the documentation. And this is becoming more and more of an issue in our industry. What's causing drift? Well, I think there's little awareness around design standards out there. You know, APIs have proliferated, but we haven't really come together as an organization to define standards and the style and the documentation practices required. There's maybe a general lack of testing and compliance to ensure that production actually matches the documentation. And there might be a lack of specification-driven code generation out there, so things aren't always in sync. Emmanuel Paraskakis, CEO at Level 250, tells me it boils down to a lack of discipline, essentially. Discipline to design and deliver API products intentionally with market feedback and with design artifacts that should be followed. And sometimes it's probably a hard thing to argue for within an organization because you might be able to produce and develop things totally fine without this specification-driven approach. Well, I would argue like it's not really scalable in the long run, especially if you're managing hundreds or thousands of APIs. So ways to avoid API drift. This is an article that I'm writing currently, and hopefully it'll be published at that URL soon. Maybe by the time this presentation is out on the interweb. Essentially, I looked out to some people in the space and collected some feedback, and they're saying ways to avoid this drift issue. You know, use open API specification as a source of truth, generate docs from that spec, incorporate things like linting, contract testing in a CI/CD pipeline, and then continually test production and ensure that API is in sync. So if you go too far off the trail, you might get lost in the woods, right? And you might end up like my daughter here, and we still haven't found her. If anyone has any information, let me know. Bill@NordicAPIs.com, as Travis mentioned. But seriously, this has kind of led to some people being like, well, maybe we should incorporate more governance for our API services before things get out of hand, before we get lost in the woods. So API governance, that's my next trail post sign on this walk through the API economy. Where we're at with large organizations right now, often there's multiple formats in use, right? We have REST services serving JSON over HTTP. We still have some SOAP and XML holdouts. We have a lot of event-driven architecture and asynchronous workflows, GraphQL, gRPC. Often, a single organization will be using all of these styles at the same time, perhaps for different use cases to complement different design practices. It might be done intentionally, or it might just be ad hoc, and developers will be siloed using their different styles throughout the same organization. We're also seeing this multi-gateway and multi-API management condition emerging. People are using different tools within the same organization. Like maybe this emerges after an acquisition, for example. One company purchases another company and grabs all their legacy tools, so you end up having this kind of disparate portfolio. Or you might even both be building REST APIs, but have different design styles and standards. So all of this is happening right now, and it's led some people to believe that we need to govern this portfolio a little bit better. And so what does governance mean in terms of APIs? Well, it's better inventory management for APIs, consolidating these tools and gateways, centralizing our design and security patterns, and overseeing how the life cycle is managed and how we change these services and bring awareness to them as well. Some organizations are even looking to build their own automated internal development platforms to help with this governance process. One example is Atlassian. I recently interviewed Dougald Morrow, developer advocate at Atlassian, for the Nordic APIs blog. And this was kind of an interesting case study on what a prominent tech organization is doing to kind of solve this API governance issue. Essentially, they're creating this internal governance program and encouraging extensibility standards to be followed. They're incorporating things like automated checks and rules. And the result, they're seeing some significant advantages already. Of course, this is just a work in progress, I'm told. But it's enhancing their stability, and they're finding that they're having less broken APIs, because that's a good result out of a governance issue or a governance program, right? You want to increase stability and avoid the possibility for breaking change and unhappy customers. So it seems like this work in progress is going well for them. As I'm told by Jerry Snyder, CEO of Firetail, API governance is more than a single tool. He says there are essentially no tools that can solve all the necessary use cases around inventory, lifecycle management, and governance out of the box. So essentially, it's more of a mindset, it's more of a culture, at this point at least, if someone comes out and produces a tool that does it all for us, might make a lot of money. But right now, it's more of a culture and a practice, I'm told. So let's keep on walking down that trail and check out a new trend. This one, developer experience, is a trend that's been going on for a long time in the API space. But I think we focus too much on the whole onboarding and getting to hello world aspect of API integration. And I like to think of developer experience as being more of a continuous flow, right? You first have to discover what API works for you. You need to onboard it, do some testing, try out integrating it, and hopefully by then you are able to integrate it into your application and reach some value out of the API service. Then comes maintenance. Perhaps some fields or parameters have been adjusted. Maybe there's a major version that you need to acquiesce to or change to. And then you kind of start this process over and over again. So I think putting more forethought into the whole life cycle and the change management aspect, how things are communicated to developers, is going to help maintain more long-term integrations. And what makes a great API developer experience? Well, I've been thinking about this a while, writing some blog posts on this. I think it boils down to great documentation, self-service capabilities, putting as much transparently out there as possible, depending on your regulations or circumstances or what you're allowed to show with partners. Having stable change management to make sure that things are communicated and developers don't have any unhappy surprises. We've seen a lot more interest in SDKs lately and code generation for them. But basic things still apply, like design, consistency, great naming conventions, and other things. In fact, academia is looking into this right now. I promised a PhD candidate I would spotlight their project in my presentation today. They are creating a model for what a usable API looks like, and they were requesting input from the industry, so I thought this was a kind of cool project. I put in some thoughts. They're trying to determine what makes a good usable API to then create a model for how we assess the usability of APIs. So if you're interested in that, if you'd like to share some thoughts, definitely take a screen grab of this project. Yeah, in general, API developer experience continues to evolve. Like I said, I think we need to get beyond the whole onboarding and integration phase to think of new ways to improve that API development experience. One interesting potential is incorporating AI into the whole API development lifecycle. One example in our industry is Plaid's Bill, and I have not sponsored this. I have no relation to this. I think they called it Bill because it's like the platypus's Bill. I think that's their mascot for this AI or whatever. Anyways, this is integrated into their developer portal. It's this conversational agent, and you can ask it pretty complex things about how the API functions, and it will give you back some helpful advice on what code is needed for your project. I think AIs like this are probably a better use case than fully relying on a public LLM, which might be trained on outdated documentation, Stack Overflow comments, YouTube video tutorials that are old and not relevant. Whereas something like this, they're actually training it on their internal data, internal documentation, so the level of accuracy is going to be higher with more of a finely tuned LLM, I believe. So just one interesting use case of incorporating AI to enhance developer experience. But making the argument for developer experience and improving it isn't always easy. So I encourage you to make the case for cost savings, right? I mean, improved efficiency and workflows can save companies money. There's less turnover and onboarding because there's less tribal knowledge if things are more publicly aware. There's also less re-engineering and more accountability. If you're creating great usable services, you can actually increase access to a wider talent pool as well. And this was part of an article I wrote for DevOps.com recently, and I was pretty astounded by the input that I had to this question. You know, can improving developer experience reduce costs? And everyone agreed wholeheartedly that it can. So just a good thing to think about if you're having to make that argument internally. Which moves me on to attacks on APIs. As we're walking through the trail, we might encounter some bear attack like this. Hopefully not, but we're in the API economy, not on the trail, and we are seeing more attacks on the rise, attacks on APIs. Web attacks against applications and APIs surged by 49% between Q1 2023 and Q1 2024, according to Akamai data. And according to them, 108 billion API attacks were recorded from January 2023 to June 2024. So this has been an ongoing issue, but it continues to worsen. And it's taking its toll. Insecure APIs are resulting in up to 87 billion in losses annually, according to Marsh McClellan Cyber Risk Intelligence Center. And someone here did some research, Dan Barahona, told me that after analyzing 100 breaches, the top 3 attack types present in these breaches map pretty well to the OWASP API security top 10. So I just wanted to show that very briefly. I know there's a lot of words here. But essentially, those top 3 risks are some issue around broken access control, authorization, broken authentication, property level authorization. There's a lot of authorization issues lately out there. It's become very common. The one highlighted in purple here is related to GraphQL. Found our friends at Escape, which is a GraphQL company, and after doing some research, they found that that was a very common issue with GraphQL APIs, unrestricted resource consumption. And then the other 3 that I've highlighted in blue are some new risks that emerged in 2023. I think the 6th one, unrestricted access to sensitive business flows, is an interesting one because it means that attackers are taking advantage of logical gaps in the API, which might not be a traditional vulnerability, but something just to think of, and it's related to like the business design of the service. I just want to breeze through a couple more trends as I see it. API-first business is definitely on the rise. According to Postman's report from last year, 2/3 of respondents say their APIs generate revenue, and 43% of these generate over a quarter of the company's entire revenue. So I think this is pretty impressive. It shows that APIs are no longer just some offshoot of an existing platform. They're becoming actual products in their own right. There's also this trend out there around the whole unbundling of API management. We've seen some analysts comment on this in the API space. And if you see this come up, if you see this unbundling word come up, it essentially means breaking apart monolithic lifecycle management services for APIs and using more discrete fit-for-purpose tools. Either the API management vendor might be doing this, or the API provider might be stitching together things like developer portals, documentation, monitoring, et cetera. And it's kind of a response to like the previous monolithic platforms and doing something that's more cost-effective and not as wasteful. So that's what unbundling essentially equates to, and we've talked about this a couple times on the blog recently. So to wrap up the whole trail metaphor, we started there with API ubiquity. We ran through a bunch of these trends through attacks and unbundling of API management. And my hope is that by walking the talk and following the signs along the path, you can get to the end of the trail peacefully and hopefully with no bear attacks, missing children, or ghosts and shadows. So yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.